All right, let's make a start. Happily today it is actually being recorded, so that's good. After a couple of weeks of it not being recorded. That's glad they finally fixed it. Okay, so welcome to the final lecture of Kit 711. All I'm going to be talking about today is the exam. So you've got a good expectation of what that's going to be, what it's going to look like, and how to go about studying for it effectively. Initially, I'm just going to briefly chat about some assignment stuff, then obviously the exam. So the major assignment's due this Thursday. Some of you have already submitted it even, so good job to you guys. It is a paper and an electronic submission, so there are those two things. I will physically mark the paper copy though, so if you forget to mark physical paper copy, you might get your marks late. So make sure you submit both. The electronic is for that ongoing record. The paper copy is what I'm actually marking. It's a group submission, so only one group member needs to submit it. Under the electronic submission, though, you can each see that submission when it goes in under the group in Milo. Obviously, the paper copy, you only want one person to print it off. If you all print it off, then I end up with like 5 or 4 copies, and I only need to mark one, so save the trees. When you submit your paper copy, though, there should be a group cover sheet that gets submitted along with it. I did get an email from a group yesterday, maybe, saying we've already submitted it, but we didn't do a group cover sheet. Do we have to submit the whole thing again? No, just put the cover sheet in the box. It's all good. When you submit the electronic submission, as always with Milo stuff, submit a Word or a PDF, don't zip it. That's just a great way to annoy the lecturer right when they're going to mark your work, because it means we've got to unzip it, then we've got to re-put it into Milo. It's like, let's get the lecturer really angry right as they go to mark my assignment. Terrible idea. At 3 p.m. though, once the assignment's due, the web PA system will then have another assessment that's unlocked as we do our peer assessment for the assignment. That'll be open for 7 days. If you miss that, tough, just like everyone is messaging me going, oh, I forgot to do the peer assessment 3 weeks ago. Can you reopen it? No, you've missed it, you've lost marks, that's the way life goes, you're an adult now, congratulations. So you've got 7 days to do it. It'll take about 5 minutes to do it. It's really not unreasonable for me to expect you to do it in 7 days. As you go to do that peer assessment, please be honest. Please say how much work you really think you've done, how much you think your group members have done. I've already had people in my office complaining, saying, oh, I did it all even on the peer assessment on the other stuff, but they didn't do anything. Can I change it now? It's like, no, you submitted it. You said they did work. If they didn't do any work, you can't now come and change it later. So if someone's not doing work in your group, when you do your peer assessment, say they're not doing work. This will affect the marks. It doesn't mean they get 0. It doesn't mean you get a lot more. But if everyone in a group is saying that a particular person wasn't doing anything, then they are going to end up getting less. But it's important it's honest. I know of a few groups that have got a few issues going on, and so people have emailed me and stuff, and so those group marks I'll be looking at closely as well to make sure people aren't ganging up on someone without due cause. But please be honest. The peer assessment for the major assignment will have 4 or 5 different things in it about different parts of the assignment. And so if someone did a lot of work on one section and not so much on the others, that should be reflected there, and that evens it out. That if they did a lot on one section, everyone else didn't do much of that section, it then evens it all out. So please be honest about it, especially if you didn't do much work, you shouldn't be claiming you did more than everyone else. That won't work anyway, because the rest of your groups are not going to agree with that, and it then sort of sticks out, and I'll be looking at all the numbers anyway. But yeah, Thursday, 3 o'clock, that unlocks. You've got 7 days to do it. Any questions on the major assignment that are left? I've had lots and lots of ongoing questions over the last week or two. All right. we have coming up now, and in lots of your units you'll be getting this same kind of reminder, and so this is my spot for doing that reminder. We've got evaluate surveys, which is the way the university gathers feedback on courses. So go fill that out. It is fairly important for you to fill it in so that we can find out any issues in units and things. This semester we've had some problems in the lab, and so I'm expecting there'd be some comments relating to that. So feel free to put those down, especially with problems in the lab in terms of the setup and the way things are working. Like the fact that when you log in, it then syncs. Shouldn't be doing that. It should be syncing on log out like it did in 501 last semester. So feel free to put in that that's sort of frustrating, that you come into the lab and you log onto a machine and then you can't use the machine for 10 minutes. That is actually unacceptable. That shouldn't be the way it is. I'm constantly complaining about that, trying to get the lab fixed. And so by all means, put that in your evaluates. The more of you that complain about the lab not functioning the way it should, the easier it is for me to get more resources to get it fixed. It's been quite frustrating for me this semester, and I'm sure it's been frustrating for you guys as well. But that said, ignoring those lab problems that are very frustrating, I guess you could ask yourself, as you go through those questions, did you find this unit interesting? Is it providing you with something that's interesting, that's a bit different to other units? Are you feeling like you've learnt things? You're at this institution to get a piece of paper that says you know things. It's fundamentally what you're doing, getting a degree. And so I guess the question is, did you learn in this unit? If you feel that at the end of this unit you've actually learnt nothing, in that you knew all of the things I taught you before you started, then that should be an evaluate. That's true for any unit you do. If you've done a unit and you're like, I knew all of that before the unit started, that's certainly worth putting in there, unless you're already an expert. That's a bit unfair on the lecturer. But hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you found me approachable. Lots of people have come and seen me in my office and asked lots of questions, so hopefully you found me approachable and that sort of stuff. But fill in the evaluates, not just my unit, all the units you're doing. It's a great way to get for us to get feedback. All right, getting to the final attendance thing. I'm doing the attendance here for a couple of reasons. That probably might be worth me actually now mentioning why I'm doing the attendance while you're sort of logging into Milo. Attendance in lectures is an interesting thing to me, and I over the summer read a couple of research papers around how students perform when they're in a lecture versus not in a lecture on their final exam. And so I was a bit curious about that. We have optional lecture attendance. There's no marks attached to coming to lectures. It's purely, do you learn the content? And so I got very interested about that, and I thought I should, on one of my units, take attendance in lectures and then just see how do people go who are in the lecture versus people who are not in the lecture. I've got all the stats of you watching recordings. So if you watch a recording, I've got the data on that. I know exactly how many minutes of recordings each and every single one of you has actually watched. I can look at that. And so I was like, well, I wonder if there's a benefit to being in my lectures. And so that's why I've done this across the 7 weeks I've done it. And specifically today, I'm doing it going, is the exam review lecture useful? If I then get all your marks and plot them against who's in the lecture today, are all you guys the top 100 students and the 60 people who aren't here, are they the weaker students? Or are people not in lectures getting HDs? And so I thought, I'll do that. So that's partly why I'm doing it, a big part of why I'm doing it. Doesn't relate to your marks in any way, shape or form, because lecture attendance is optional across all of our units, unless there's lecture assessments built into them. So that's a big part of the reason why I'm doing that. You might find that a bit annoying, but I also find that if I take attendance, more of you turn up, which in previous experience when I've taken it a couple of times and people turn up, the average marks did go up. So on my previous ones when I have taken attendance, the average marks did go up when I did take attendance, but I didn't do enough of it to see statistically was it significant. And so that's why I'm kind of doing it, just because I'm a nerd. I like to see, can I teach better? If everyone who's not here gets the highest marks, then I guess I should change my lectures or something. All right, so is everyone on to Milo? The password today for our final one, security. Possibly the worst password in the world after password 123. So the password security, I think you should remember that. I'll ditch the lights. I'm wearing a blue shirt. This is my dog. And that's its Instagram account. It's training to be a therapy dog. My wife is a psychologist, and so Frankie's its name, goes to work every day with my wife and sits with people in her office and stuff. It's a Japanese Spitz is what kind of dog it is, a Japanese Spitz, hence it's called Spitz Tricks. Yeah, she's 19 months old, so she's still a bit of a puppy. But yes, blue shirt. And I'm going to see Solo tomorrow. Has anyone seen it yet? No one's seen it yet? Oh. $111 people have done it. 113 people have done it. All right, who's still going? 1, 2, 3. All right, are we all done? Almost? Almost. All right. Boom, boom. All right, let's get into the lecture then. Bye-bye, Frankie. Okay, so a couple of things. Realistically, exam performance, so sure, it's cool. Exam performance and people doing well in exams is usually the result of a couple of things. First one is they actually know the content, obviously. The other one is actually having realistic expectations on what the exam is. When exams happen, people then often don't do well on them and they might get a sup exam. And if you get a supplementary exam because you've almost passed but didn't quite, people come and then see me, right? And they then look through their exam to see how they went to find out what they don't know. Commonly when they do that, what I sort of find when I talk to them is they say things like, oh, I didn't know what was going to be on the exam, or I didn't know what the structure of the exam was, to which I'm then very confused because I have lectures like this one that you're about to have about the exam. I've got past exams that are available, and so those students often don't grasp what the exam was going to be like, and so then they don't go well on it. My intention for this entire lecture today is for each and every one of you, when you leave, to have a realistic expectation of what is the exam like. What kinds of questions might I ask? Or how can you best prepare to know what questions are going to be like? I'm going to go through last year's exam, but I'll also highlight how many different exam years are actually useful to you. So there's probably 3 or 4 exams you can look through that are very useful for studying for this exam. And so those students who often don't do well are people who have not gone and looked at those past exams, and so then don't quite grasp what kinds of questions I might ask. So hopefully by the end of today you get a good understanding of what kinds of questions does Joel ask, how much time or how many words am I expecting on a question, and things like that, or what style of answers. So that's what I'm hoping you to get away from it. The exam will actually contain content from lectures, tutes and our readings. So all parts of our unit are examinable. Realistically, the vast bulk of the exam is based on lecture content. I haven't measured as it says there, but the bulk of it is lectures. If we then think of our tutorials, practicals and our readings, that other content most of the time directly built on top of lectures. So this week's practical is on Kerberos, for example. We had a lecture on Kerberos, and then today in the practical we're doing it. There's no new content actually in the practical this week at all. We're going over the same content from the lecture in a hopefully more meaningful way that you can then get it in your head about how it works and how it operates. So it's going over the same content. And so if you asked yourself, if you saw an exam question on last year's exam about Kerberos or the year before or whatever, oh, where did this come from the unit? Is it a tutorial question? Is it a lecture question? It's actually both. And so as I say, content will come from lectures, tutes and other readings. You might need to think, okay, how do those readings relate to the lectures? How do those tutorials relate to the lectures? And what you might look at and go, okay, Joel did a lecture on authentication. If we then look at our practical from last week, we looked at passwords, breaking passwords. We saw salting mentioned there. And so me asking a question about password security is not only a practical question based on the written material on that cheat sheet, it also relates to the authentication lecture. It also relates to probably some of your logical security chapters in the case study. But realistically, it's mostly the lecture and that practical. Some of your content you might have covered on your written tasks. Could be useful. But realistically, I'm writing the questions based off lecture content, tutorials, and the readings. Other content you might have covered might actually help you to answer better, but I am basing it really primarily on that lecture content. And so those readings, some of our readings, added a bunch of depth to what we actually covered in the lecture. So I'm now going to just quickly do a zoom over of what content have we covered as a reminder to you about where we've been. This isn't me summarising the unit in terms of telling you what I care about so much, but it's just reminding you what content have we covered. At this point, if I asked you, what did we do this semester, you might respond with, oh, we did a really big major assignment about a case study and we got flooded. Right? Realistically, we've done a lot of stuff in this unit, but it's 10 weeks ago now, you might have forgotten it. So before I go through last year's exam, we'll just quickly zoom through what we looked at. So we started off in that first week kind of doing revision, really, saying what's security, what's networking, because this is a networking security unit, and we sort of just reminded ourselves of confidentiality, integrity, availability, networking with the OSI stack to sort of remind us of our context, really more than anything. Week 2, we then looked at different kinds of attacks, and we had an hour looking at different kinds of attacks that can occur against systems. And then we moved through into penetration testing, which is really about highlighting why we're learning about those attacks. If we're defending a network, we need to know what kinds of things can happen against us. If we're becoming a security engineer, we actually might break into systems for a job. And so we've got to know about attacks so we can know how to best serve our clients who want to know about what vulnerabilities there are in the systems. Week 3, we did 2 other little topics, one on virtualization, so we looked at virtual networks and virtualized servers as a tool in our armory of defense. Having virtual networks so we can have policy applied to different parts of our networks, very important. Having virtual servers running makes it quite easy to do backups and redundancy and a whole range of things around the stability of our ICT infrastructure. So virtualization was a bit of a 15-minute little nugget around that sort of context. We also then moved into personal data security. And so we're thinking about how can we think about data security, how can we think about users' data, why should users care about their data, and we talked a bit about that. We then had a fairly big lecture around identity and authentication. This then we looked at further in week 10 when we had smart cards and RSA tags. We had a password tutorial quite recently as well. So that idea actually kept coming up again and again and again. Identity and authentication are probably pretty key parts of some of our major assignments about how in our case study organisation, how are they identifying, how are they authenticating the users in their systems. We then, across several weeks of lectures and then several practicals and then our major assignment, we looked at risk and threat analysis and actually then wrote policies in response to that as well. So that's a fairly major part of the unit, looking at how do we know what are the threats against an organisation, how can we plan that out. We had a reading on it about STRIDE, which is a framework for undertaking that kind of analysis. And obviously we wrote mountains of policy, or in the process of writing mountains of policy for the major assignment. We spent quite a bit of time looking at different cryptographic protocols. Kerberos is our practical this week. We looked at IPsec, digital signature, TLS, SET, Tor and Bitcoin. And in last week's lecture we had forensics. So we have had a fairly big, sizable chunk on cryptographic protocols. Not so much the individual building blocks, that was 501 content, but how those building blocks get used together to meet an overarching bigger goal that we actually care about. That's what we're looking at with those protocols. But yeah, last week's lecture, we looked at forensics. It was only a short lecture that we then did there, 1 hour lecture. Across the tutorials, we've done some basic networking, we've done some penetration testing, that built on top of our lecture on it. It built on top of a reading we had about penetration testing as well. And so realistically, the penetration testing was actually with 4 weeks of practicals, plus the password breaking, plus a reading, plus a lecture. That's 7 different bits of content we learned in different classes or reading around pen testing. If we think about what we did, though, in the practical context, using Metasploit, for example, isn't something I can particularly ask a big exam question on. I'm not going to ask you, what payload do we need to do this? Or what variable are we setting on this? That's not an exam question. But an exam question could be around the processes we're going through, what kinds of roles do the different phases take, and those sorts of things. We're looking at those higher level concepts as more of an exam thing versus setting an IP address or whatever. That's not an exam question. So we're looking more at the theories so much in the practical part in the exam. We had a chat in one of our classes, it was in week 7, where we broke up into groups and talked about 3 big topics. We talked about whistleblowing, we talked about cryptocurrencies, and what was the last? Social networking in the workplace. So we talked about some topical issues to try and get to know who's in our practical before we made groups, as part of that, really. But also we were talking about security problems and thinking about those sorts of problems. Yeah, we spent 3 weeks on the risk and threat analysis. We did a firewalls and intrusion detection shoot, and we've got Kerberos this week. Realistically, the firewalls and intrusion detection is really the only content that we did in a practical that didn't have a lecture that went with it. The lecture that goes with that practical we did in 501, really. Firewalls were mentioned a couple of times, especially around policy, deciding if a port is open or not, or whether a person can communicate on our network or not, is a policy. A policy that's implemented by a firewall as the technical artifact that actually implements that policy. So it's a good example of a policy, but beyond that, we didn't really talk about it in our lecture contexts. All right, so what sort of format is the exam? Now, as most of you probably remember and have looked at with the unit outline and things like that, this unit is mostly assessed internally. 60% of our mark is internal. So when you actually submit your peer assessment and your major assignment on Thursday, at that point you've done 60% of the assessment. You've only got 40% left in the exam. Most units tend to have 50 or 60% exams. My exam's only 40%. It's a bit on the smaller side with that. So it's a smaller exam. So realistically, by Friday, a large part of how you're going to go in this unit has been decided. You've already submitted it, right? Which some people like. We're talking about evaluates. If you guys all want a bigger exam, write in your evaluates, less internal assessment, give us a bigger exam. Because some people are, oh, 3 written tasks, it's so much. But you've got 3 written tasks instead of a bigger exam. We can go to 2 written tasks, just make the exam bigger. So that's the sort of weighing up that sort of goes on. It is a smaller exam, it's only worth 40%, but you still need to pass it. So if you've gone perfectly this semester, and after the major assignment gets marked, you're sitting on 55, or maybe you're sitting on 60. No one's sitting on 60. You've still got to actually get over the 45% hurdle on the exam. So you can't, if you're already on 50, say you're on 50 out of 60 so far, which is a HD, I guess, you can't go, oh, well, I've already passed the unit, I'll not turn up to the exam. That doesn't work. You've got to still clear the 45% hurdle on the exam to actually pass the unit. So 45% internally and on the exam to over 50% total to actually pass the unit. The exam's 2 hours, so it's a small exam, it's only worth 40%, and so to match up with that, it's only a 2-hour exam. It's not a 3-hour exam, it's only a nice little short 2-hour one, including there's then 15 minutes of reading as well. It's 120 marks, so it's a mark a minute. So as you're working through and you come across a question that's worth 10 marks or whatever, you've got to think, oh, that's a 10-minute question. Joel's expecting this to take about 10 minutes on average for me to do this question. So it's not a one-word answer. Right? There's 2 sections to the exam. The exam goes into 2 halves. We have section A, which is worth 70 marks, where we've got 7 questions, each worth 10 marks. So each of those questions I expect to take about 10 minutes on average. Maybe you'll take 8 on some and take 12 on the other, that's fine. But 70 marks in section A across 7 questions. Section B is worth 50 marks, and there's actually only 2 questions in section B. Section B, there's 2 questions, question 8 and question 9, each of which actually have an option. So there's 4 questions in section B of which you do 2. So you get to have a bit of choice in section B as to which questions you do. We'll look at last year's exam and that'll become really clear how that works. So section A is where we've got some sort of short answer questions. Now, as I said, 10 marks, 10 minutes. So these aren't expecting answers that are pages and pages long. These are expecting maybe half a page answers for those questions. They're short answer. Some of them have got sections. Some of them are just one question that I'm expecting there to be, about half a page worth of work to answer it. Each of them's worth, 10 marks. Section B, as I said, has 2 questions, 25 marks each. There's going to be 4 listed, and you've got to do 2 of them. But they come in pairs. So you've got to do 1 from each pair. But that'll become very clear in a moment when I show you last year's exam. In terms of what can you take into the exam, you can take in some support material. You can take in an A4 piece of paper that's double-sided or 2 single-sided A4 pages. So you can take in some notes. You're allowed to take in some notes. It can be handwritten or typed. What I will say about this, and this again comes back to me giving advice and then seeing what happens and seeing people fail the exam because they've not followed my advice. Right? You're allowed to take in notes. Right? It's really super useful. You don't know how to answer a question, you've got some notes there, hopefully you can then help to do it. To get the most out of this, you should write this page yourself. I know when I go to mark the exam and I see all the pages there, a lot of you are going to have the same page of notes. And you know why? Because maybe this guy over here, maybe this guy's the smartest guy, the guy you think is the smartest guy, right? Hope you get the smartest guy. He writes a great set of notes. Amazing set of notes. For him. He's already the smartest guy, right? He's written on that piece of paper the notes he needs. If you guys then use that, all the stuff that's in his head that he didn't think needed to be on the piece of paper is not on the piece of paper. So all of the goodness he's got up here is not on that paper. You've got to use that piece of paper. It doesn't have stuff that you need because it's got stuff he needs, right? The advantage of this piece of paper is for it to have notes on it for stuff that you find hard. Not that another student finds hard. So we've got Cobros this week, right? Let's say you really understand Cobros. Another student might find it really hard. The notes that you need for Cobros on that sheet of paper are now dramatically different. What if the person who understood Cobros did not understand IPsec, right? And the person who doesn't understand Cobros fully understands IPsec. Their sheets of paper need to be different for them to be useful. I don't care if they all match. If you all rock up with ones that match, it's fine. I don't give a toss. But what I see every single time is the students who have the matching sets of notes all do poorly because they're all relying on that one other person who made the notes to have made the perfect notes for them, which they haven't done. They've made the perfect notes for themselves, which is what they should do, right? The idea of this page of notes is for you to put down things that you find hard, that you don't understand, that you don't know well. That's where you get the most benefit out of it, right? And if you've got a page of notes that doesn't include that, it doesn't help you, right? And the person who wrote the notes, they're not going to put down stuff that they already know off the top of their head because it's wasting space. So I urge all of you to write your own page because by doing that, what you also do is study the content, right? By the best, because they call these cheat sheets in a positive way, the best cheat sheets I have, and there's one on the wall of my office actually. Come by my office, there's a perfect cheat sheet on the wall. The best ones of those, I find, if I'm when I'm sitting in reading time and I see the different students, and I, specifically the one in my office, I remember seeing the girl who wrote it. She was smashing out the exam in that first 15 minutes, right? She was madly writing things down. She got like 85 or something. She got a really high mark. I talked to her afterwards because she came and asked me for a reference. And I said, I loved your cheat sheet, it was great. She said, oh, I didn't even use it. If you study well and prepare your cheat sheet, what you find is because you've studied well, you no longer need the cheat sheet because it's all up here anyway. And so the person who actually prepares the cheat sheet, the smart guy in the corner, they've all got it up here anyway. They don't need the cheat sheet anymore because it's all actually in their head. So it's actually a way of studying is preparing that sheet. But anyway, half of you will do the same one. Most of those people will be the people that fail and do a sup. That's what happens. Last year, the people that all got the sup, I counted it. I think the people got sups, it was actually in 501. People in 501 who had a sup exam last year. I think there was like 27 supplementary exams and 21 of them had identical cheat sheets on the first exam. It's obvious. It's completely obvious that, oh, these guys are idiots. Anyway. Okay, so with this exam, this is not the first year KIT 711's been offered. It's been offered for a couple of years, more than a couple. And so over that time, there's been a couple of exams. Those exams are all available. You can go and look at those exams, and I'll show you how in a second. This slide is not particularly useful today. This slide is useful to when you're studying and you look at those past exams and you go, Joel said some of the content changed. What content changed for the exam I'm looking at? Or you look at an exam, you look at the 2015 exam and you go, what's that question? I don't know anything about that question. What is that? You can then come and look at this slide and go, yeah, we didn't have that content. Joel said we didn't have that content, therefore it's not on the exam. So across the time, I'll use this so it's on the recording. The units changed quite a bit. During 2014, 2015, it changed quite dramatically. For example, in 2014, Tor, Bitcoin and forensics were not lectured on. So if you look at those exams, there's no questions on Tor, Bitcoin or forensics. All three of those topics you had this year, for example, right? So if you look at past exams, it's important to, question I don't know about, but he didn't ask the question about forensics, so maybe he never does. So, well, no, that year I didn't teach about forensics, therefore there's no questions on it, right? 2015 did not have threat, risk and policies, so there's nothing about threat, risk and policies. Prior to that point, 2015, 2014 had lots of cryptography questions. 501 questions. Because what actually happened is the introduction to cryptography, symmetric, asymmetric, hashing, moved from KIT 711 to KIT 501 in 2015. So if you look at some of those older exams, and it's like, what's hashing? You're not getting that question. You had that question last semester in KIT 501. You don't get it now. 2016 and 2017, last year and this year, are the closest ones. Oh, there should be a T here. Addition 2. Sorry. 2016, 2017 were very similar to this year. So they're quite useful to look at. Some of those previous years, go look at them, but a bunch of the questions actually won't be as useful because they won't be there. We did not look at this year PGP particularly. It was actually supposed to be in this week's practical, but the lab's still not finished being set up, so I had to remove the tute. That's why this week's tute will be a bit short. We didn't look at hashing at a deep level. How does a hashing algorithm work? What's the structure? How does the algorithm work? That would be in some previous exams. It's not in this year's exam. We didn't look at operating system security models, which is question 7 in 2016. So there's some removed content. But refer back to this slide when you're looking through past exams. If you come across a question you're like, I have no idea what this is, email me. Say, hey, question 3 on 2015, is that a possible question for this year? And I'll be like, no, we didn't cover that content. Can't be a question if we didn't cover it. All right, let's jump over to here. Right. So I've opened up a browser, right? UTAS library. Open up UTAS library website. Go to the search. Kit 711. Luke, what are you doing? What? Why don't I have Kit 711? What? What the hell's going on? I literally did this search. What is that? Well, no. What the hell is going on? Show me no. Search instead. What's it doing? This has gone poorly. Hey! I don't know what just happened. That was bizarre. I always... Anyway. Choking. If we look here, we can see 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. Those are the exams that were given in those years. So you can open them up and have a look at them. If I click that, it's going to ask me to log in, probably. Oh, no, it didn't. Cool. So there's the exam that we had last year. 2 hours. Same joker. But this is last year's exam. You see it's got 9 questions. Same as yours has got 9 questions. The instructions we saw a moment ago on a slide, literally copy and pasted into my lecture slides. You know. All right, what kind of questions? Does the short answers. So question 1, define and discuss the 4 stages of penetration testing that were covered in tutorials. Now, that's a pretty easy question. What are our 4 stages? Anyone remember? The first one starts with R, it's a fairly long word. Reconnaissance. Yep. So this is basically breaking down. It tells you there's 4, and it tells you that it's a 10-mark question. So when I go to mark this, there's 4 things, equally weighted. Your description of each of those 4 stages will be worth 2.5 marks. Right? That means each of those descriptions at 2.5 minutes or 2 minutes. So it's not a one sentence. It's realistic. This is a 10-mark question. I'm spending half a page you defining them. But if we look at the question, it's not just defining them. Define the goals. What are we aiming to get out of each of the phases, right? So when you're actually reading an exam question, it's important to look for particular words. Define and discuss, we see a bunch. So one, I want a definition. Define means give me a definition. What does it mean? One sentence. Discuss the goals. He wants more than a definition. He wants to know what is the point of this phase. What's it aiming to do? For the first 3 phases, they're all aiming to do things to enable the next phase to occur. So really, your description and discussion should end up linking all of these stages together because it's one process with 4 stages, and clearly they build one on top of the other. I'm a big fan of diagrams. Diagrams are great. Our pen testing tutorials had a diagram of these 4 stages. It was an upside down pyramid, wasn't it? Great opportunity to throw a diagram on a page. Quite a few of you don't have English as your first language. Good job coming to Australia to do a degree. I've taught in China. I could not do a degree in China. Terrible Chinese. Worst Chinese ever. In terms of speaking Mandarin. If you're doing an exam in a language that's not your native language, diagrams are your best friend. Diagrams go across language barriers. So if there's a possibility to do a diagram in a question, by all means do a diagram. Lots of stuff in this unit has a nice obvious diagram that can go with it. This one's diagram's not as key as some other ones would be, but it does demonstrate you understand the flow of them going from one phase into the other, and it makes it nice and easy to remind yourself to communicate that it's an incremental process building towards a goal. All right? On to the next one. Two-part question, 6 marks for the first part, 4 marks for the second part. So immediately we're like, right, got to spend more time on the first part, got to write a really good answer for that bit. If we look here, this is about Kobaros. So we had a lecture on it, had a reading on it. This week's practical is on it. Should see if anyone who did this morning's practical can answer the question. Explain the goal of Kobaros. Who wants it? What's the goal of Kobaros? What's its point? Single sign-on. Beautiful. 4 marks for that part of it. He was in the tute this morning. Explain the goal of Kobaros. Explain the concept of single sign-on. Nice and easy. Describe how its components are structured to achieve their goal. Oh, hang on, we've got components, we've got structure. You know what that should say to us? Diagram. Great opportunity for a diagram because you can draw the different components and then describe what's happening. Describe the authentication flow of that single sign-on going through the diagram. Explain the goal of an authenticator. Explain the goal that an authenticator is aiming to achieve and describe how it achieves this. Authenticator is all about ticket ownership. All about, is the ticket I'm receiving actually owned by the person who sent it to me? That's what authenticators are all about. And we've got 4 marks there. Not particularly diagrammy, but it is about understanding the purpose and the point of that particular part of the protocol. Question 3, another 2-parter. This time it's equally done, so they're equally sized. Describe the importance of salting in the context of password storage. So that one there, that's a practical question, isn't it? I mean, we talked about passwords a bit and security problems with them a little bit in lectures, but we really drove that home and saw it in much more detail in the practical class. Oh, I did too. That's because I scrolled. Sorry. I'll finish 4, then I'll come back to 3. Sorry. It's a Monday. What is password entropy and how does its consideration affect our choice of password? So password entropy is how random is our password. So it's actually also a question from that same tutorial class. The more random our password is, the harder it is for a person to guess. Harder it is for a person to guess. And if we're making rainbow tables or we're brute forcing by generating lots of passwords and doing it, if it's really random, the rainbow table needs to be massive to find it. Some of us, when we were playing around with that online little web portal that had billions of passwords in there, found things that weren't discoverable by that program. That means the entropy was greater than the dictionary of passwords that were in that rainbow table. So the more random it is, the harder it is for someone to guess. Us adding numbers and special characters and that sort of stuff to our passwords is trying to force up the entropy, to try and add randomness. Okay, so coming back to 3, he is the smartest person in the room, there we go. Explain the difference between identification and authentication. So that was our week 4 lecture. Our week 4 lecture talked about identification and authentication together. Now, identification is knowing who we're talking to and about. And if we think about what's happening on this page, that very first field where we put in our email address so we can log into Milo is us claiming an identity. And so that's actually passive in that the system is sitting there waiting for us to claim an identity. Active identification, active systems would actually try to figure out who we are without us claiming an identity. So identification versus authentication. Identification, who is the identity we're actually claiming to be, or indeed can we figure out who it is? Authentication is verifying that identity. So the password part here is the authentication part. We're claiming an identity here. And so you guys could all come here and put in my username there. You could all claim to be me. My email address is public knowledge, therefore my username is public knowledge. You could all claim my identity, but without my password, you can't authenticate. That's the difference between identification and authentication. Authentication is verifying that claimed identity. Discuss the security benefit of using smart card and RSA. So this is, to pardon the pun, a token question for our lecture about tokens. So that was about our smart cards and RSA dongles that we had the lecture about week 11 maybe. It was around there, week 10, week 11. We saw smart cards and RSA tokens there. Some of you went into much more depth on RSA token-like devices, time-based codes, in your second written task. So some of you would actually answer that really well. Last year's written task didn't have that topic, and so I don't think I probably would have asked the same kind of question. I'd be more specific to the lecture and more away from a written task, I would have thought, this year. Question 5, describe in detail the process of Bitcoin mining. So this is a very broad question asked with very few words. It's still worth 10 marks. It's still worth the same amount as the ones above. And so if we look at it, we go, doesn't really say much. What's Joel wanting? Well, this is me setting up saying, tell me about Bitcoin mining. Now, if you just told me about, yep, we've got some data, we hash it, we look for the outcome. That is defining the very practicalities of the mining process. So you get some marks, but you're not going to get all the marks. It's also about saying the sort of, what is that achieving? What is that mining actually doing? It's adding a transaction onto the ledger. That is what mining's achieving. The goal of mining is about adding transactions onto the public ledger. The way it occurs in Bitcoin is a proof of work. We've got those hashes that you could then describe in that very practical way. And once you've actually done that, you get a reward. It's also how wealth is generated inside the Bitcoin protocol. And so at the moment, by doing mining, by adding something to that ledger, you get 12.5 Bitcoins, which is about 100 grand. So Bitcoin mining is the technical part, but there's then also what's the goal? What's it actually trying to achieve? What's that surrounding context that motivates why you do that? Question 6, define risk analysis, explain its purpose with examples. Define threat analysis, explain its purpose with examples. And what are the main differences between risk and threat analysis? So this is a 10-mark question about those sort of 2 steps in a process that we've undertaken in our assignment, we had in the lectures. The lectures around the 2 of those are basically the same from last year to this year, but obviously we've now got the slight difference is that Stride is an added reading this year that wasn't in last year's course. as we're looking at these and what are the differences, risk and threat are figuring out what are our vulnerabilities in our organisation. But they've both got, in the way they've been defined in this unit, they've got slightly different outcomes. Threat is trying to establish the likelihood of a thing occurring. You know, is it definitely going to happen, or is it never going to happen, sort of situation. Risk is what's the impact of that thing happening. The flood here, which is an act of God, water come downhill situation, it's a 1 in 100 year rainfall event, and so its likelihood is very low. Its impact, somewhat dramatic on the high performance computing node that's in the basement of engineering that got drowned. So there's two processes for that same thing, in that case a flood. One mentions its impact, very high impact. Its likelihood, very low. You getting a phishing email sent to your secretary in your organisation, likelihood, very high. Impact, well, it really depends on what your organisation's doing about security with her. The secretary, it could be a guy. Are they trained to not click on links in emails? Are they not trained to click on links? The impact could be quite substantial. The likelihood of it occurring is certain. It's almost certain on a weekly basis, certain. And so the risk and threat analysis are really looking at two parts of it. One is impact, one is likelihood of it occurring. You combine the two of them to find out what you actually want to defend about, what you need to defend the most. Define and discuss the goals of the 3 A's of digital forensics. So this was last week's lecture. We had acquire, authenticate and analyse. Those are our 3 A's there. And so we've got 3 different things, and we're just defining and discussing. So each one's worth about 3 marks, and if you do all 3 of them well, you get the 10 marks. Is really how I tend to mark that kind of thing. So we've got 3 things being talked about out of 10 marks, and we've got define and discuss there. So I'd be having 1.5 marks for defining each A, 1.5 marks for discussing each A, and that's how that would then get marked. Any questions about section A? Cool. Okay, so if we jump down to section B, and this isn't really where I then give big worked examples here. Section B's got 2 questions, question 8 and question 9. And in these sections you've got a decision. You need to do 1 in each question, and you've got a choice. So in section 9, you could choose to do A and ignore B, or you could do B and ignore A. It really is up to you which ones you do, but the idea is you do 1 from this pair and 1 from that pair. You don't get to do 2 from 8 and skip 9. Doesn't work that way. You do 1 from 8 and 1 from 9. Now, if you do happen to have extra time left over and do another one, I'll still mark it, and I'll give you the one that's got the highest mark. But if you race through the exam with the intention of, I'm going to do multiple in section B and get a high mark, and you do rubbish on section A because you've gone through too fast, you're not going to have gotten anything. If you did both of these, like, yes, I've done both of them, and you got 14 on this one and 13 on this one, you'll get the 14. 1 mark extra. What was the cost in racing through and not doing section A properly? That might be minus 15 marks, right? So make sure you actually do a good job on the compulsory questions before you start going, I'm going to do an extra one. Because what I have seen, not always, but what I have seen often is people who might attempt extra questions often have done poorly on other questions quite dramatically, and I'm not sure they really got a benefit there. They might have actually harmed themselves by trying to be a bit rushed through. But that said, if you get a section A and I've got no clue on this question, I can't do this question, I've got no clue whatsoever, I got someone else's cheat sheet, they haven't covered this stuff, I don't know it because I didn't prepare my cheat sheet, you might as well have a crack at one, I guess, because you've got spare time, but better off actually doing a really good job in the first place. These section B questions are longer than the section A ones, obviously, Captain Obvious. We're looking for more depth here. Me, I'm looking for more depth here. In section A, you can commonly get quite a lot of the marks by just stating the facts about that question and just regurgitating some things. Hopefully, you know, in your discussion and impact and things, you actually are adding more than that. But realistically, a lot of these questions, you can probably get to the pass mark on the questions without really thinking about much, just regurgitating facts. You get to the pass mark maybe. That's really not the case in section B. Section B, it's really much more about what is the impact of a thing, discuss in depth about a thing, give me an opinion about a thing that we've talked about, right? So there's much more depth here. Or we're comparing one thing to another thing. Like this one here is comparing SSL to SET in the context of e-commerce. There's quite a bit going on in that question. Or it's an in-depth on a particular protocol that's got quite a lot to say. But these are 25 minutes. 25 marks equals 25 minutes. These are 2.5 page answer questions. If you're writing an answer to this and it's a quarter of a page or half a page, you're not getting the marks. You're really going to be 1.5, maybe to 2 pages to get a really good answer. Because those exam pages aren't very big. Exam pages are pretty small. So these are in-depth answers that are not far off half an hour of writing time. If you think about it, that's really what it is. Now, what I would suggest to you all with these questions is when you go to answer them, probably don't just sit down and go, I'm going to answer this question, start writing out an answer that's like an essay. What I would suggest you do is actually think about the question and do a couple of bullet point plan for what you think you want to talk about, and then write your answer below it. When I've suggested that before and then people have done that, they've usually done fairly well. And what I tend to find is that people do that because they've organised their thoughts first and they've thought about where their answer is going, they've then been able to write, and in the high pressure exam sort of room, they've been able to look back at what they thought about when they had their thoughts organised about where to go with the answer. And so they haven't missed things. Whereas questions where people have answered and they've just written, their thoughts are rambling as they're going, they're not really organised very well, and they forget things that they clearly know about, but they've not written it down on the page. Whereas you've got a couple of bullet points at the top. Step 1, I'm going to talk about this. Step 2, I'm going to talk about this. Step 3, I'm going to... Then you go and do it. You can look at, where did I get up to? What have I got to talk about? Because otherwise you forget about things. If you run out of time halfway through that last question and you've got your 7 steps you want to talk about and you've got to number 5 and I'm marking it, I'm like, oh, well, we're going to talk about these other 2. I might then give you a pity mark for the stuff you haven't got around to writing yet because I can see your intention to write about it. Your argument was then sort of summarised at the top. So just a good idea, mostly so that you don't forget to write about things. Often I've read someone's essay or response to one of these big questions and they've nailed 80% of the question. They've done a brilliant job, but they just forgot part of the question that I'd even seen them highlight on their question sheet. So they knew about it, but they just forgot about it in the stress of the exam. And because it wasn't written down, I couldn't give them any marks. But they'd done the rest of it. So they did a really good answer for the rest of it, but they just missed a bit because they forgot to. Yeah. Any questions on section B? All right. That's pretty much it for today's lecture. So first off, good luck everyone on the exam. Hopefully you do really well. People who do good exams make examiners happy because they're easy to mark. If you do a really good job, it's easy for me. A good answer is like, yes, tick, 10 out of 10, excellent. Much faster to mark. But yeah, if you've got any questions, come and see me down the front. Oh, question, yeah?